I am here with Chris Schweizer,
Hello.
the author of one of my favorite series, the Krogan Adventure Family series of nonsensical adventures. But it's really does amazingly well in my library.
Well, thank you very much.
And thank you so much for putting them out. So I will now ask you the 5 fabulous questions.
Okay.
Question number 1 is, how did you get started working in comics?
I got started working in comics basically because my dad suggested that I should try it as a career, because I'd always drawn comics. I'd done a comic strip in my school newspaper in high school, one in my college newspaper. I had drawn a lot, and I was starting to notice the comics and graphic novel section really expanding in Barnes & Noble and Borders and places like that. You know, for a long time it was only reprints of Spider-Man and things in that vein. And then all of a sudden you started having books by, Craig Thompson and Dan Clowes, and everything sort of hit around between 2000 and 2005, everything sort of exploded. So I was slowly becoming aware of this stuff, and I was doing I was just drawing a comic for fun, a longer one, and my dad looked at it and said, you know what, you should try to do this for a career. And that was a big thing for me, because while my dad has always been very supportive, he's also an incredibly pragmatic person. He's worked in music publishing for a long time and knows how difficult it can be doing something that you love for a living. And the fact that he sort of had that confidence in me, it was something that I had never considered before as a career. It was something that I'd always enjoyed doing, but I never thought that I could try to make money with it. And his pushing me in that direction was a huge step, and really was sort of a culminating moment. From there, I discovered Raina Telgemeyer's one of her mini comics online, and it mentioned mini comics, and I was like, I bet I could do a mini comic, and it sort of grew from there.
Oh, okay. People mention Smile all the time, but nobody's mentioned her mini comics before, which are wonderful.
They are. They're very wonderful. Well, she did a 3-page story about reading Barefoot Gen, which was the first manga that had been translated into English, and that somewhere, and I read it on her website. I don't know how I found it originally. I think I was so hungry for anything I could find that I was looking everywhere. And on the website it mentioned, well, this was originally published in one of my mini comics. And I thought, mini comic? What is a mini comic? I bet it's a comic that you print up yourself, fold and staple, and make available that way. And I was like, I can do a mini comic. And so I did my first comic pretty much that afternoon. I got really excited. It was called Goodbye Beard. The first one from the standpoint of wanting to do this professionally. I'd done a lot before, but that was sort of the shift. And I made it 6 pages and printed them up and made them myself, and that was sort of the start. I got so enthusiastic about the process of it. Once I'd done a 6-page comic, I thought, well, maybe I can do a 12-page comic. So I did a 12-page comic. From there, I did a 24-page comic, and then eventually I did like a 300-page rhyming mini comic with my dad, and then that led to the Krogan books. And but that starting small is so important, and anyone who is wanting to do comics, I would always recommend starting with short form, doing something small, learning your chops, and sort of developing from there.
Yeah, I've actually heard Raina say that as well. So question number 2
Yes.
is, did you read comics when you were a kid, and if so, who were some of your influences?
I did read comics as a kid. Big influences when I was younger. Bill Watterson. I started reading Calvin and Hobbes roughly around the time it started being published. My grandfather had been a big comic strip fan. He really loved Pogo and Peanuts. He passed that love on to my dad, and so growing up, we always had comic strip collections in the house, tons of them, lining the shelves, and so I always had access to those and would read them. In terms of things that I sort of sought out on my own, my great aunt gave me she gave my dad a book, and he gave it to me. That was basically a comic adaptation of the first half of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes, the first Tarzan book.
Cool.
And I loved that book when I was a kid. It was big, hardcover, had Tarzan fighting a warthog, and Tarzan fighting a lion, and Tarzan fighting a gorilla, and as a result, I think all of my comics now have a person fighting an animal in pretty much every installment, which I didn't really realize the correlation until recently. But I read a lot of comic strips. Once I got into middle school, I started reading Foxtrot. High school, I started reading Zits. A lot of the comic strips that I became aware of were well beyond my I guess, my reading level and social level at the time, but my library had collections of Berkeley Breathe's Bloom County. And I read those a lot when I was about 11. And as a result, even though I was not really cognizantly aware of what was going on, I feel like I have a pretty firm grasp of, mid 80s politics and social upheaval.
Yeah.
And so, I knew about who Donald Trump was long before I should have known who Donald Trump was.
Cool. All right, number 3 is, what are you currently working on?
I am currently working on the third book in the Krogan Adventure series, which is called Krogan's Loyalty. And it is the story of two brothers fighting on opposite sides of the American Revolution. I think with the American Revolution, there's been such a tendency to sort of homogenize the literature and make it to where we believe that everybody in America was a patriot, except for a few sort of Judas-esque loyalists who were plotting to take over their neighbor's land when the king wiped them out or something like that. And that really wasn't the case. It was about a third were patriots, a third were loyalists, and a third just basically wanted things to more or less remain as they were and to just not be affected by the social upheaval that was a result. And so I really wanted to draw attention to that with this comic. I also wanted to move it away from New England because so pretty much all the American Revolution literature that I've read is
Boston based.
Is Boston based or Philadelphia based, and every once in a while you'll have something set in Charleston, but really there were a lot of people who were very strongly affected by the American Revolution who did not have a role in its implementation. And so I set this particular story on the sort of the Carolina, Tennessee area, the southern frontier, where there were a lot of people who were settling, who were beginning that westward settlement, and had no part in the start of the American Revolution, but were suddenly entirely swept up in it. And I think that for a lot of Americans and a lot of people in general, most people don't live in Washington, D.C. Most people don't live in New York, and yet these are sort of the hubs in which a lot of the national decisions are made, but those national decisions impact everybody in America. And so to set all of our stories, you wouldn't set every contemporary story in Washington, D.C. Because of the fact that's where the political impetus of all of the events are. And yet we do that with the American Revolution. So I really wanted to do the similar type of thing, that this will resonate with anybody who doesn't. Hopefully it'll resonate with the people who live in DC too.
Right.
But it'll sort of show how, I guess, sort of the more rural and isolated areas are respond to these larger, I guess, social shifts.